Well, good morning. I'm Reverend Dr. Catherine Cullen, the minister here, and we welcome you all to this really special service. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Tim Turner. Tim is the Associate Director for Indigenous Education at Plymouth Pawtuxet Museum, our neighbor right down the road. And this morning, Tim will offer us a unique conversation that explores 12,000 years of Wampanoag history and how their communities adapted and sustained their seasonal 13-moon life cycles amid changing natural, social, and political landscapes. Tim has brought with him many artifacts which will help us appreciate their culture. He'll be passing them around the room, and we want you to know they are disinfected, and we do have hand sanitizer right over here and in the back of the room. If you feel at any time that you need to use that, please get up and do so. So very excited to have Tim with us today. We will be sharing our plate today, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But before I do that, I invite Jim Hamilton to come up, and you have something, a little handout on your seat, and Jim's going to explain a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Catherine and Tim. So excited about this today's talk. Anyway, I am Jim Hamilton. I'm your governing board president, and I am also a member of the Envisioning the Meeting House in the 21st Century Working Group. A number of the members are here today, including Catherine, and you'll see actually a list of them at the bottom of this handout. But you've seen things that we've posted in the Bell Ringer and the e-distro, but we've been working really for, God, almost 2 years because of a delay, because of the pandemic. And so the things that we're going to be doing really are going to roll out in the next 2 months, and you'll be seeing a lot of it, including testimonials during worship services. But the thing I want to talk to you about today are these 5 questions that you see on this handout sheet. And we're looking for input and feedback. These are qualitative questions about the experience of being in the sanctuary. So you can do that by, if you want to write them on the back of this and hand them to me at the end of the service. If you want to send your responses by email to me, you are welcome to do that. There's actually a Google Docs questionnaire that you can fill out and get your information that way. Some of you may have been asked to participate as part of a group where you'll go into the sanctuary and provide your responses to the question there. And actually, that's the ideal way to do it, because I think your feelings about the sanctuary, it's a different experience when you're actually in there and experiencing it, the high ceilings, the windows, the smell of the wood, everything that's in there. So I encourage you all to respond in one way or another. We want everybody's feedback, and there'll be more coming. The weekend of November 6th and 7th, we will have the consultant who's helping us with this project here. His name is Scott Taylor, and some of you may have heard of him because he is behind the curriculum whose name I always forget, Soul Matters. And so he really is just brilliant and has been very helpful in all of this process. So again, I encourage you all to reply in one way or another. You'll see the whole list of the people participating in the process there. Feel free to reach out to any of them if you have any questions. And thank you so much for your time.
So, as I said, once a month here at First Parish, it's our practice to share our plate. Once a month, we give our entire non-pledge collection to a charity or a justice organization. And this month, our recipient organization is First Nations Development Institute. Thanks to Carrie Meyer and Donna Savicki for nominating this very important group. So here's how it works. And Carrie's going to remind you about this at the end of Tim's talk as well. But you may place your donation in the collection basket. We have a couple of baskets in the back. We have a couple of bowls on the side. We are not passing the basket from one to the other because of COVID, so we're doing it a little differently. So you may put your money or check in the baskets before you leave today. You may also go to our First Parish website at uudux.org and click on the Make a Donation to FPC Here button to make a donation directly to First Nations Development Institute anytime over the next 2 weeks. We keep this collection open for 2 weeks. Or finally, you may mail a check made out to First Parish Church, P.O. Box 1764, Duxbury, with First Nations Development Institute in the memo field. So whatever you can do to make a difference, please consider donating generously. This is the one Sunday a month where all of our non-pledge donations go directly to the organization. Today, we don't gather your gifts for ourselves, but for the world. So I introduce you to Tim.
Thank you for having me here. I'm honored to be here. My name is Timothy Turner. I am the Associate Director for Indigenous Education at Plymouth Patuxet Museums. I'm from the Cherokee Nation. My people are from North and South Carolina, Oklahoma, and Tennessee today, and we're one of the largest Native nations in the United States, numbering over 300,000 people who make up the Cherokee Nation. I've worked for Plymouth Patuxet Museums now for a very short, 33 years or so. After 30 years, you stop counting. That's what I've been told. I've held various positions at the museum. I started as an interpreter when I was about 11 or 12 years old. I built up to being manager of the Native program that is at Plymouth Patuxet Museums. And for the past 4 years, I have worked for the education department. This spring, I was given the title of Associate Director, and I just love what I do. You'll see that in the presentation that I'll do with you in just a minute. I do want to read off my phone, so I apologize. One of the things I like to do before I do any presentation is a land acknowledgement. And this is something that is being done more and more around the country. So I'll read my land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a traditional custom that dates back centuries in many Native nations and communities. Today, land acknowledgements are used by Native people and non-Native people to recognize Indigenous people who are the original stewards of the lands on which we live today. We do so before any public event or important gathering. This is my land acknowledgement. We would like to gratefully acknowledge the Indigenous people on whose ancestral homeland we gather today, and that would be the Patuxet Wampanoag, as well as the diverse and vibrant Indigenous communities who make up their home in Duxbury today. So I've come to speak to you about Wampanoag people. I've worked with Wampanoag people my entire career at the museum. I'm an expert on Wampanoag culture, Wampanoag history, and that's what I'm gonna share with you guys today. Wampanoag. Wampanoag means people of the first light or first dawn. They were the very first ones to see the sun come up over Cape Cod when the sun came up in the morning. And so their name, Wampanoag, means people of the first light or first dawn. In the early 1500s, the Wampanoag Nation numbered well over 100,000 people. Fast forwarding 400 years or 500 years to today, there are about 5,000 to 10,000 Wampanoag people left today. 5,000 of them living on Cape Cod in two communities. Mashpee, there are 3,000 Mashpee Wampanoag, and the other large community is Aquina out on Martha's Vineyard Island. And so there's another 5,000 kind of spread across the country today, because Wampanoag people can live, or Native people can live wherever they want to. Their ancestral land stretched from just south of Weymouth, south of Boston, around the Weymouth area, right straight through Cape Cod and the islands, down to about parts of Rhode Island. And so they had about 40 miles along the coast and about 40 miles inland. And they were made up about 69 different communities, or what I call villages. And I want to show you, I'll pass this map around. This is Champlain's map. Champlain came here in 1524, and he just maps what he sees. This is Plymouth Harbor. This is Sacred Head, or Duxbury Beach. And you can see how many Native communities was in this area. So Patuxet ran from about the heights of Manomet, or the Pine Hills in Manomet, right through here to Duxbury Beach. And that village had been decimated by a European epidemic that came through here in 1616 through 1618. As far as we know, there were no survivors from that community. Actually, there was one, Tisquantum, but he was over in England. I show you this map. This is the Eel River, if you're familiar with Plymouth. Whereas this is Town Brook. And I'll pass this around in just a moment. And I'll pass this around. These are a list of all the large communities of Wampanoag people in southeastern Massachusetts and into Rhode Island. So Wampanoag people needed 4 really basic things to survive in the time period: food and water, clothing, houses, and tools. And one of the most important tools to a Wampanoag man would have been his bow. His bow provided a tool in which to kill animals for food, their skins for clothing, and their bones and antlers for tools. Now, a lot of you guys look at this and they go, wow, that's a pretty big bow. It's actually kind of perfect for a man my height. When you were making a bow in the 17th century, you wanted that piece of wood to be about shoulder height. And that's a perfect size piece of wood to make your bow from. This one's made out of ash. They were also made out of hickory. Those are the 2 woods that they used. The string on this is made out of sinew, which is the muscle tendon of a deer. This is a muscle tendon of a deer, stride, comes out of the hind leg. So what I'd do is dry it, I'd pound it until these fibers came off, and I'd peel those off, and I twisted them into cordage, a rope. It's also what we use to sew our clothing. We'd peel this off, we'd poke a hole through the leather, and we'd feed the sinew directly through it. No needles. Of course, you can't have a bow without arrows. A boy would have been given a bow probably at the age of 4 or 5 years old. And he would not have been given sharp arrow points for a really good reason. He doesn't know how to use them yet. So he would have started off with what we call a blunt pointed arrow. Just the ends of the stick, rounded over. And he'd practice by hitting targets that he made, maybe loops up in the tree he'd fire through, and then maybe birds and squirrels. And he became very accurate at using this. He would be given a sharp set of arrows, and his job would change. He'd go from practicing with a bow and arrow to using it. And it would have been a boy's responsibility to run around his garden and hunt down any animals in the garden. And he wouldn't just kill them and leave them there. He'd pick them up, he'd bring them back to his parents, they would skin them, they would gut them, and they would cook them. So a boy at a pretty young age was helping to provide food for his family, but also protecting his garden, which was one of the most important parts of their diet. The arrow here, the feathers on them are wild turkey feathers. They used duck, goose, hawk, swan, and the Pilgrims talk about Wampanoag people having really special arrows that had eagle feathers on them. I'll pass this one around since it doesn't have a sharp point. The other ones I won't. One of the most common materials you see Wampanoag people using to make an arrow point would be stone. I'm going to show you a bunch of stone tools today because Wampanoag people use stone for a lot of different tools. After the Europeans came here, right around 1524, the native people began to trade for metal. And so they began to get and make metal arrow points like this. Now, they didn't trade for an arrow point like this. What they traded for was something a lot larger. A pot. Now, they didn't want to cook in these pots because they had their own cooking pots, and I'll show you one in a minute. They wanted to break this apart, and they wanted to make all kinds of neat things out of it. They wanted to make arrow points, knife blades, chest protectors for battle, armbands, earrings, necklaces. So they didn't want this metal pot to cook in. They wanted to break it apart and make all kinds of really neat things out of it. Because Wampanoag people had their own cooking pots, like this one. This is a really small clay pot. I'm not cooking for a family of 10 in this clay pot. Maybe a little tea, maybe a little medicine. But Wampanoag women made clay pots like this, large enough that a small child could crawl down and hide inside of it. Very large clay pots. They'd get the clay along the rivers, they'd form them into a pot, and to make them hard, they had to fire them. And they'd fire them in a really hot brush fire. And they would heat this pot up to about 800 degrees. And that's just hot enough to fire it nice and hard like this. So they didn't want those metal pots to cook in. They wanted to break them up and make all kinds of really neat things out of them. So hunting was about 10% of a Wampanoag person's diet in the time period. And they did primarily their big game hunting throughout the wintertime. They hunted for deer, bear, elk, moose. And the reasons that they hunted them during the wintertime, there's many. In the winter, there's snow on the ground. So you can track an animal a lot easier. It's cold, so their fur is thicker. So if I make a coat out of it, it's going to keep me warmer. The animals tend to fatten up before winter, eat a lot. So they're a little heavier in the winter. But one of the major reasons that we hunted those animals throughout the winter is that it was cold. And so if I killed a big animal, I could cut that meat up and I could store it on a rack outside, and that would keep it refrigerated or frozen. Because if I killed a 1,250-pound moose, my family couldn't eat 1,250 pounds of moose meat in one meal. Trust me, they'd try, but they couldn't complete that deal. They can eat. So by storing it outside, that's the reason why we hunted them throughout the winter. We never hunted animals, big game animals, in the spring and summertime. Why? They're having babies. They have baby animals at that time. And if I kill an adult animal, I could be also killing that baby animal. So we never hunted big game animals spring through summer, only in the wintertime. So hunting, 10% of a Wampanoag person's diet. Fishing was also about 10% of their diet. They fished with spears. This is a spear point. I'll pass it around. This would normally be put into a handle, but that's a spear point. So they speared fish. They used hook and line. These are both made out of leg bone of a deer. They used nets. They used baited traps. They fished in the ocean. They fished in the ponds and the rivers. They also had nets, very large nets that they made. Nets that could be over 600 feet long. And they'd stretch them out along the edge of the water. They'd put poles in the ground. They'd tie the top of the net to that. They would tie weights to the bottom of it. And they'd put it out at low tide, right along the water's edge. At high tide, the water came right up and over that net. The fish never saw it. As the water dropped back down below that net, any fish that didn't swim out swam into the net. So it's called a gill net sometimes, and sometimes it's called a tidal net. But they could be over 600 feet long. So fishing, about 10% of their diet. They also foraged. They go through the woods. They get nuts, roots, leaves, and probably most important, berries. Wampanoag people had no way of sweetening their food. There was no sugar cane here. Honeybees were not brought here until after the Europeans came. So there was no honey. And maple syrup, we didn't have the sugar maple trees here. They were up north, up in the Nipmuc country. Now we traded for some, but the Nipmuc are pretty smart. They knew they had a good thing, and they weren't trading very much of their maple syrup. So berries were a way that Wampanoag people sweetened their food. So they would dry and preserve as many berries as they possibly could so that they had them throughout the season. So gathering, about 10%. 70% of a Wampanoag person's diet came out of their garden. And a family would have an acre up to 3 acres of crops that they grew. And they grew corn, they grew beans, and they grew squash. Now, a lot of you may have heard it referred to as the 3 sisters, or the 3 sustainers of life. Not a Wampanoag term. That comes from the Iroquois people up in New York. So, yes, they grew corn, beans, and squash, but they never referred to it as the 3 sisters, or the 3 sustainers of life. Wampanoag women would take care of the gardens. And like I said, they produced corn, beans, and squash, and that was 70% of their diet. So a really important part of their diet. So that's a little tiny bit about food. I want to talk about water, or where they got their water. A lot of people might think a river, a stream, a lake, or a pond. You never wanted to drink out of any of those sources. Imagine me drinking out of a river, and 3 miles up that river, there's a dead moose laying in the water. Probably not a good thing for me to drink that water. So we drank from springs, which are just small areas, bubble water up out of the ground, and that's where you get our water from. You can look in it. You can see that there isn't a dead animal in there. You can see that the water isn't bad. So when we were making our homes, we made sure that we made our homes really close to a drinking water source, because you don't want to travel miles to get a cup of water. So they drank water. They also drank tea. They made tea out of those berries. They made tea out of leaves, roots. Sometimes hot tea, where they drank it right away when it was hot. Sometimes cold tea. They let it cool down. I think the most important thing that a Wampanoag person drank in the 17th century was soup broth. They drank a lot of broths to soups. And there's all kinds of really good things in soup broth. If I roasted a turkey and we ate as much of it as we could, I'd take the whole thing, bones and all, throw it in a pot and boil it up. And when I boil those bones, that boils the calcium right out of it, okay? And so if I'm drinking that broth, I'm putting that good calcium into my body. So soup broth was an important part of what they drank. The one thing I'll say about food and water is that Wampanoag people did not have a set meal time. There was no breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner is a way that we ration our food. Wampanoag people did not have to ration what they could hunt for, what they could grow, what they could gather, what they could fish for. So we ate when we were hungry. Whenever we were hungry, we'd go up and get something to eat. And you might be eating with somebody, or you may not be eating with anybody at all. Just depends on who was hungry at the same time you were. And it was said that a Wampanoag person would eat 4 or 5 meals throughout the day. And you wouldn't eat so much that you were stumbling away. You'd eat enough to fill that void in your stomach because you could always come back and get something to eat later on. So that's a little bit about food and water. Wampanoag people had 2 different styles of homes. They had a summer home and they had a winter home. Their word for home in their language was Wheatiu. Wheatiu is the word for home in the Wampanoag language. In the summertime, Wampanoag people would move out along the coast, right here in Duxbury, and they would live in single-family home sites on 1 acre, 3 acres of land, and they'd live in a small dome-shaped mat-covered home like this. And you can just drop it right there. I'll come pick it all up. Thank you, my friend. This home here would have had a family of about 5 to 7. That's the average Wampanoag family. That was parents, grandparents, and children. Grandparents were an essential part of a home in the 17th century because they were the teachers. They taught the children everything they needed to know to survive. They taught them through games, and I'll talk about that later, and also by storytelling. This home here is made out of cattail reeds. If you don't know what a cattail is, it's that large green grass that grows in swamps and rivers with a brown hot dog thing on the top. That's a cattail. The women gather cattails probably late July, early August. They split them into individual leaves, they sun dry them, and then they weave them into these mats. And these mats are amazing. Cattail is an aquatic plant. It lives in the water. So what these mats do is when it rains, like a dry sponge, they swell. And it seals up the entire roof of the home. And just like a dry sponge, when it can't take any more water, the water deflects. It deflects off these reeds, and it goes down the natural gutter shape of the roof, or the reed, and gutters off the roof. So it's like having thousands of sponges and gutters on your roof. On a nice sunny day, those reeds shrink back down, and they allow air to pass through. So it's a very, very nice, cool summer home. You don't want a hot house. So this would be for their family, 5 to 7 people, out along the coast. In the fall, they'd take the mats off this home, they'd leave the bare frame, and they'd head inland. And they would move about a half mile to a mile inland into a wooded valley protected by their trees, and they would live in bark-covered structures like this one. Now, automatically, we go back to high school, or not high school, elementary school. We'll go, oh, that's a longhouse. Listen to the word, long house. Do those sound like any native language? It's English, right? So the English call these longhouses. A Wampanoag person would have named this home according to how many fires were inside of it. This house that's at Plymouth Patuxent Museums is 34 feet long. That is not a very large winter home. Our winter homes would get well over 100 feet long. They could fit 5 families, 50 or 60 people in one house. Wampanoag people were what we call matrilineal, or I call matrilocal. Everything went through the woman's line. As a boy, everyone who was in my house, and matter of fact, everybody that was in my village would have been related to me by my mom. And so when I got to the age of getting married, I would have married outside my village. Therefore, I knew I was marrying outside my family. And I married into my wife's community, into her village. And everyone that was around us were her family and would support us. This one that's at Plymouth Patuxent Museums, I said, is 34 feet long. About every 10 feet inside that home, you'd see a fire. So this house has 3 fires in it. So we learned a few minutes ago, the word for home was wheat to you. But if you came to me and said, Tim, what do you live in? I wouldn't say, I live in a wheat to you. You know I live in a house, right? I'm going to describe my house. And the way I describe my house is by the number of fires. I would call this a nush wheat to you, which means it's a 3-fire home. A lot more descriptive, right? These winter homes will last about 10 years. The framework is made out of cedar, swamp cedar. That's bug resistant, it's rot resistant. Lasts you at least 10 years. The roof at Plymouth Patuxent Museums, that home is covered in tulip poplar bark, not what you'd see Wampanoag people using in the 1600s. They would have used old growth chestnut or old growth elm. The Pilgrims talk about the average chestnut tree being here, that 5 Englishmen could barely get around it, touching fingertip to fingertip. Trees that we couldn't possibly imagine. They talk about the white pine tree towering over 200 feet tall, 80 or 90 feet before you saw any branches. They said a squirrel could have gone from the tip of Cape Cod all the way up to New Hampshire, just jumping from white pine tree to white pine tree, never touching the ground. Those are some of the descriptions of what the forests look like. Now we know that Wampanoag people cleared inland from the coast about a half mile, away from the rivers about a half mile. But after you got there, you would have seen dense forests. Your winter home, like I said, will last you about 10 years. After about 10 years, your sanitary facilities, not so much anymore. Your firewood, you're probably going further and further into the forest to find dry firewood. Your animals are starting to deplete in your area. And your house is beginning to rot. So you cut loose all the material, let that fall back into the earth, and it's going to rot. And you'd make a new village somewhere else. So you got about 10 years out of your winter village. Your summer site, not so much. About 3 to 5 years. And you go, why, the house is going to rot? Your ground is getting depleted. And so you never wanted to strip the earth that badly. So you got about 3 to 5 years out of your summer site. So that's a little bit about housing. Let's talk about clothing. The one thing I'll tell you about clothing for Wampanoag people, it was very little to do with warmth. It was more about body protection, protecting your body from branches, thorns, those type of things. The first picture I'm going to show you is a picture of somebody you might recognize. He's slightly younger in this photo. Has a little bit more hair also. It's a picture of me. I was about 18 in this one. I'm older than that now. I'm wearing what we call moccasinage, which are my shoes. Most of your clothing, guys, is going to be made out of deer skin. So white-tailed deer in the Wampanoag language, the word for it is atuk, and it means the one you hunt. It's the one animal that they hunted the most. So my shoes here are made out of deer skin. They're my kind of summer moccasins, kind of like your low-top sneaker. In the winter, I'd make them out of elk or moose skin, something really thick, and they'd be more like boots. They'd come up my calf, and I'd wrap around. And inside of those, I would probably put beaver fur or rabbit fur up towards my foot, because the hair is hollow, and it will absorb your body heat and keep your feet nice and warm. I'd grease these moccasins up with black bear fat. I'd take black bear fat, I'd boil it, I'd let it cool into a lard, and I'd smear that all over my shoes. And that would waterproof my shoe. I'm wearing what I call leggings. Essentially what you might see a cowboy wear, those chaps. Somebody who rides a motorcycle has those chaps. Very similar. It comes to about just above my knee, and it's leg protection. It would protect my body or my legs from being scraped up by branches or brambles or whatever. They're also made out of deer skin. I'm wearing something called a loincloth. You can't quite see it in the photo here. What it is a very long strip, wide strip of deer skin. And I wear a belt, tucks up underneath the belt, flops over like an apron. It tucks between my legs like a diaper and goes up and over the string or the belt in the back and flops over like an apron. So that's called a loincloth or a breechcloth. I'm wearing a mantle, which is kind of my top, kind of like what the Jolly Green Giant wears, kind of under one arm and over the other. And then in this photo, I'm wearing a beaver pelt coat. This is a beaver pelt. So they would take 10 or 12 of these, sew them together, and they would wear that so that the fur, again, was in towards their body, because the hair is hollow, and it will absorb your body heat and keep it close to your body. The skin, when we tan an animal skin, and tanning is a process that Wampanoag people use to cure a hide so it didn't rot. The last thing that they did to it is they'd smoke it over a smoky fire. And what that does is seal up the pores in the skin, therefore making it waterproof. So not only was this my winter coat, it was probably my raincoat. And at night, those 10 or 12 beaver skins, perfect comforter. Another way that they stayed warm was by taking that black bear fat. They'd take that black bear fat, they'd boil it, they'd cool it into kind of a lard, and they would smear that, excuse me, all over their body that was exposed to the cold air. And what that did was to clog up their pores in their skin, so no heat escaped out of their body. And then it also provided a nice thick layer of fat between their skin and the air, kind of like blubber on a whale. You know, it keeps a whale warm. So that's how they stayed warm. I'll show you a picture of a friend of mine. She used to work with me at the museum. She's Chippewa and Mohawk, but very similar to how the men are dressed, except for the women would wear a skirt that wrapped around their body. But not in the summertime. They'd wear a loincloth, just like I do. I'll pass these around so you guys can take a closer look at them. So, food and water, shelter, clothing. Last thing I have to talk about is some tools. And I'll talk about men's and women's roles in the 17th century. And I'll wrap up with games, and then I'll take some questions. The largest stone tool that you'd see a Wampanoag person use is this. This is a stone axe. This was not meant to take down a tree. What we would do to take down a tree is, if I'm looking at a tree 3 feet up, I'd pack it with wet clay. Then I'd start a fire, and I'd burn a void into that tree in the direction I wanted it to fall. Then I'd circumference the rest of the tree with fire, and I would use this to chop the ash. And every time you chop that ash, you're exposing new wood, so it catches fire quicker. This, it's called a togunk. Listen. Togunk. Togunk. Makes sense, right? Right. stone knife. And everybody thinks about stone and they go, oh, it's archaic, it's old. Sure it is. Some of the most skilled surgeons today still use stone for surgery. Obsidian. There is nothing sharper than it in the world. Nothing man-made. And they use it to take cataracts out of people's eyes. And they do so because it's so sharp, it won't scar their vision. And if you're removing cataracts, you're doing that because you can't see, right? They're having an issue of seeing. So stone is not archaic. Some of the most skilled surgeons in the world still use stone. So this is a stone knife. This would have been used for skinning an animal, gutting an animal, cutting up animal meat or bones. I'm not going to pass this around. But stone was, a stone knife like that. It didn't have to be that fancy. You could take two stones, break them apart, and take a sharp piece from that and cut things. This takes a lot of skill. I've been working with stone for 20 years. I'm not here yet. This is a stone scraper. When you take the animal skin off the animal, one of the things you have to do is remove the meat and flesh right away. So this would be used to scrape the animal skins. This is a stone drill. So they would drill through shell, bone, wood. The way they drilled, rubbing it between their palms. And they'd drill right through whatever they needed to. If you were eating in the 17th century, you most certainly had a wooden bowl and a wooden spoon. These were hollowed by using hot coals and burning them out. Same way that we made our boats. So you had a wooden bowl and a wooden spoon. Your other utensil for eating? Your fingers. Lots and lots of finger food in the 17th century. So wooden bowl, wooden spoon, fingers. They did have cups. This is my cup here. Again, it's a piece of wood that's hollowed out. This is called a toggle cup because it has this deerskin tie and this bone toggle. And this was their traveling cup in the 17th century. This could get tucked underneath their belt. And you go, why is that important? Because if I happen to come into somebody's home site, even if I didn't know them, the very first thing they would do is to offer me something to eat or something to drink. But what they did not do was to make a whole bunch of bowls and spoons for people who may just show up at their house. Okay? So if I didn't have my own traveling cup and everybody was eating, I probably had to wait. So this is that coffee mug you leave in the morning, your first traveling cup, right? And it's also made out of wood. And you can see there are beautiful designs on them. They carved animals. They carved designs into them. They definitely knew how to make things beautiful in the 17th century. Not that there was a lot of it, but this was their war weapon, what we call a tomahawk. This is the #1 reason why there wasn't a lot of war in the 17th century. Think about how close I would have to get to somebody to hit them with this. Pretty close, right? Think about how angry I'd have to be to kill them with it. So diplomacy won out. When they could not work things out by talking it out, they might play a football game on a beach where the goals would be up to 1 mile apart. You could see 200 to 2,000 men playing this game. They'd paint their face according to the team they were on, and that merely was to disguise themselves. Because the only rule in this football game was to get this ball through that goal 1 mile down the field. So if somebody ran by me with a football and I did one of these, and they tripped over my leg, part of the game. Say they fell on the ground on top of the ball, and I punched them in the face, also a part of the game. It would, you didn't bring weapons out there. You weren't killing people, but injuring them, sure. Usually, whoever scored the first goal would be the winner. The Pilgrims said that this football game could take up to 3 days. At the end of the day, they'd mark the spot, place the football there. The next day, they'd come out and play it. And so it was a non-lethal way of settling differences. I'm not going to say that there was no war. I'm just going to say that there was very little war. They knew war took people's lives. They knew that that took food away from a family. And so they settled their differences diplomatically or through a football game like that. This here is a cradle board. It's what you put your papoose, your baby on. Papoose is an Algonquin word, not from this area. This is called a footboard. There's a really good reason it's called a footboard. That's where the baby's feet go. So their feet go on here. Their little wiggly toes would be out like this. And you would wrap them up in animal furs, lace them in here like a pair of shoes. And the way the baby would be in there is in this position, the fetal position. It's the position that all of us were in your mom and dad's tummy. And I tell the kids go, I was in that position. I'm like, it's not a hotel in there. There's not a whole lot of room, so you are cuddled up in there. So it's a very comfortable position for a baby to be in. And the baby would stay in here about 4 to 6 months until it built the neck muscles. Do you want to come up and try it on? Are you sure? You going to make me try it on? Okay. So the way they wore this. That's how they wore it. Your neck muscles are some of the strongest muscles in your entire body. Most people can lift their entire body weight from their neck muscles. Let's say most. This left their hands free. I could carry other things. I could be working in the garden while I had the baby. And baby was perfectly safe. Archaeologically, guys, they're finding native skulls because they carried not only their babies this way, but if they went out and got firewood, they'd wrap it up in a rope, go across the head. Anything that they carried would carry that way. Archaeologically, they're finding native skulls with indents in them because they were carrying things from a very young age while the head was still developing. And so it wouldn't slip off your head. Hopefully. So they wove all kinds of different bags and baskets. As you can see, beautiful designs. What they were using were plant fibers. The inner bark of the basswood tree, milkweed, dogbane, false nettle. So I'll end with 2 things, and then I'll take some questions. Let's talk about men's and women's roles. Men did anything that took a life or altered a life. I'll give you some examples. I would take the life of a tree, take its bark off, and I'd alter it into my roof. I'd take the life of a sapling and make it into my frame of my home. I'd take the life of an animal, alter its meat into food, and its bones into tools. So men were life takers or life alterers. Women were life givers or life sustainers. I'll give you some examples. Obviously, women gave life to babies. They also gave life to the garden by planting and taking care of those crops. They sustained all those lives by cooking, by making clothing, bags and baskets. So they had very defined roles in their community. The last thing I want to talk about is games. That is the way that we educated our children, was all through game playing. The first toy a boy might have is this one. This is a moose leg bone that I have sharpened. These, for lack of a better term, are moose toe bones. They come out of the foot of the moose, and I've hollowed them out. They're on a string, and it's very similar to cup and ball or ring and pin. And what I try to do, we'll see how I'm doing today, we'll see if I'm a vegetarian or a meat eater, is I try to flip them up and catch them on. It is kind of early in the morning. I only had 1 cup of coffee. Oh, strike 1. Strike 2. Okay, so I'm obviously a vegetarian who likes meat. So you flip it up and try to catch it on like this. And a boy would try to catch that first one on, say, 10 times in a row. Then he'd flip it up and try to catch the first 2 on 10 times in a row. Then he'd flip it up and try to catch all 3 on 10 times in a row. And the boys would have competitions with this, okay? And the skill that they were learning was hand-eye coordination. What do you need hand-eye coordination for? Shooting a bow, spearing a fish, right? Girls had dollies. The mom may have cut out the animal skin, gave it to the young girl. She poked holes through it, sewed it up with sinew, stuffed it with animal hair. She would have made clothing for it and painted on that clothing. She would have made jewelry for it, and she would have learned how to sew, how to make clothing, how to paint on clothing. So these are just 2 toys that I showed you. Imagine learning everything you needed to know through games. Thousands of toys, thousands of games. So we have a couple minutes. I would really love to take some questions. Now you can ask questions about Wampanoag people today. You can ask questions about something that I talked about. But raise your hand, I'll try to grab a few questions.
What were they basically using in medicine? They had a fever. What were they using?
Yeah, I don't talk about particular medicines because I don't want somebody to go, oh, I have a fever. I'm going to take what Tim just took, and they break out. The only thing I will say is that they had medicine people. They were people who showed strength in learning how to use plants, and they would train with another medicine person. And they might train their whole entire childhood, and they may not be considered a medicine person because not only did they have to heal medicinally, but they were spiritual healers too, through ceremony. And so they're what we call powwows. Words sound familiar? A powwow today is a gathering of Native people. And the word powwow is a medicine person. So when we go to our powwows, we dance and we sing and we bring our culture back in. It's good medicine for our body. That's why they're called powwows today. Not a group of Native people meeting together. It's sharing our culture, dancing, singing. Sure.
Can you talk about the money exchange and clams that they?
Yeah. Everybody says wampum was a currency for Wampanoag people. It was not. It did not become a currency until the English made it a currency. They began to fine Native people for working on Sabbath, on Sunday. And they would fine them, say, 50 fathoms of wampum. You know what a fathom is, right? 6 feet. These were hand drilled with a wooden stick and sand. And then they were ground. So when they're being fined 50 fathoms, the entire village, the only thing they're doing is making that wampum. And that's where it becomes a currency. I'm not going to tell you they didn't trade it. Yes, they did. Wampanoag people would trade this all the way up as far as the Great Lakes. They're finding these beads archaeologically. And the only place you're finding this shell, New England and New Jersey. So we know that the beads were being traded up there. Now, not a bead, a necklace made out of wampum, earrings made out of wampum. And what are the Wampanoag trading for? In the Great Lakes, they have copper. So copper earrings, copper necklaces. So they're trading for refined items, not a raw bead. And so everybody thinks wampum was a currency. It was not made a currency until after the Europeans came here and began to find native people wampum. Yep.
Didn't have a face.
Very good reason. We did not want our children to think that they had to look a particular way. Happy, sad, beautiful, ugly. So we didn't put faces on our dolls. Yep. Oh, absolutely. There were laws. There were rules. If you broke the rules, you were punished. So murder, if you murdered somebody, you took somebody's life, you would expect the family of the other people to come take your life. And if that was your brother or sister who murdered somebody, you probably want to keep them around, because if they take off, that family might take somebody else in your family. So murder was one. Adultery was another. That was most certainly with a separation. And then being a thief, if you stole. If you stole, they would bring you out in front of your whole community, and they would tell everyone what you did. If you were dumb enough to do that a second time, the chief might take you out in front of your community. Again, tell everybody what you did. You had to return what you stole, and they might beat you. If you were not smart and did it a third time, they would scar you for life and send you out of the village. Taking the tip of somebody's nose off, putting a very large slit in their ear, and sending them out of their community. But people would see that scar and go, I shouldn't trust this person. But really, there was very little stealing. And the reason for that is you could make everything you needed. It's not like today. We don't have this, we don't have that. We either go without it, or we have to spend our money to get it. They could make everything they needed. And those people who were lazy and didn't want to do any of those things, well, they were unmarried, because there wouldn't be a woman in the world that would want me if I couldn't construct a house. There wouldn't be a woman in the world if she couldn't plant a garden or cook that I'd want. And so those people, I call them the unmarried or the unmarriable. We all have them in our families. Stayed with their extended families. Anyone else? I'll be right back to you.
Can you talk about spirituality?
Very general, because it's a part of our culture that we don't share a lot about today. It's the only thing that hasn't been profited from or written about. I will tell you that we all believed in a creator, singular creator. Everybody goes, Native people had 13 gods. Absolutely untrue. We believed every plant, every animal had a spirit. Okay, so when we took a plant's life or an animal's life, we would offer tobacco, thanking that plant or animal for giving up its life to sustain our own. The English thought that, and they said, they're praying to it like a god. It wasn't a god. So we had a singular creator. We believed him to live in a garden in the Southwest. And if you were a good person in this life, your spirit would freely go to Kitanuit, to the creator. And he had a big garden in the Southwest. And we were always buried with our earthly possessions because we believed in an afterlife. And we'd take those possessions with us into our afterlife. So it was a spirituality, not a religion. Religion's very scripted. We lived our lives a very spiritual way, in tune with nature, the animals, And we made sure that we used everything we could from those things out of respect for those plants, animals, trees, for giving up their life to sustain our own. And answer it?
Controlled burning related to forest fires, preventing, did they do that around here?
Wampanoag people were very well known for slashing and burning all the undergrowth. I mean, look in these, can you hunt through that? You can't hunt through that. You can't see an animal. So they slashed and burned all the undergrowth. And that was so smart because that encourages new growth, which brings the animals into closer to you because they want that new growth. So yes, they slashed and burned the forests. They had controlled fires, and that's how they took care of things. Sorry. So not necessarily a cemetery. Generally, they buried their people on tops of hills so that the water ran away from the graves. Yeah, so like in in Plymouth, if you guys are familiar with Plymouth Public Library, there's that hill on Nook Road. That hill is filled with native graves. And they're generally marked with what I call head and foot stones. Okay? So there's a stone at the head, stone at the feet. And they were buried in the fetal position with their heads facing the southwest so that their spirit knew where the Creator was. Music? So yeah, they sang, they danced. I'm not going to do either. Lousy at both. I scare the spiders in the shower when I sing. So they had rattles, they had drums, they had rhythm sticks that they banged. But singing and dancing is something that they did every single day. It was a way that they entertained themselves. It's a way that they passed time. So singing and dancing is absolutely something that you would see them do. I'm not a singer, and I'm not a dancer. But there are people. So this is a rattle. It's just rawhide. This is unbrain tanned skin that was wet, stretched, and then dried. And there's seeds inside of there. Yes?
Transportation, I know that they walk so much and if you may boat.
Absolutely. So yes, they walked quite a bit. A lot of our, thank you very much. A lot of our roads today started off as native footpaths. Route 3, 6 and 28, 44, 58, all were Native American pathways. The most famous country in the world, or in this country, Route 66, started off as a native pathway. Thank you, my friend. So yes, footpaths, but machoons, boats. Yep, they made dugout boats by burning and scraping out the inside of a log. So boats and footpaths. Yes?
Go fishing.
It's really not so much fishing. I mean, maybe a mile or so. But they went out as far as Nantucket, 30 miles out in the ocean, in very large dugout canoes. And when I say very large, I mean boats that can fit up to 40 men. You're talking about a tree that's 60 to 90 feet long, that is 5 feet wide, and you'd see 2 men sitting 20 men down. On what? I don't go into it a lot. We've had so many people try to use our culture that I don't go into it very much at all. So yeah, there was a guy in Arizona who was selling spiritual weekends in a sweat lodge. Okay, you guys may have heard of this. He was tried and convicted because he murdered the 11 people that were in there because he didn't know what he was doing. And so I don't go a lot into our spiritual stuff because I don't want people to adopt it. Anybody that is openly selling native culture and ceremonies like that, you should have a big question mark on, because for native people, we just don't share so much of that. Yep.
Can you talk about the significance of the ribbons that are coming down off your shirt, as well as other decorative elements? They're not totally functional, a little turtle and the little beavers on your bowls. And can you just discuss the
So the effigies on the bowls and spoons were just effigies. Maybe something somebody liked, maybe it was their clan or their group. My ribbon shirt. This is essentially, I've come out to you guys in a very formal setting. And just like when you go to a formal setting, you wear a suit, you wear a tie, you wear a nice dress. This is my suit and tie. So out of respect for you, I wear a ribbon shirt. These are contemporary, they're newer. And they're referred to ribbon shirts because they have, obviously, ribbons on them. But it's a formal wear for Indigenous people today. Men and women both wear ribbon shirts. So it's like your, dress shirt.
This is amazing, all the detail that you shared and the history. It goes back a long way. How has it left? How have you gained this knowledge?
So, for Wampanoag people, they were an oral culture. Everything was passed down orally. And so a lot of this has been written down by Europeans, and that's how we know it, because the native people didn't do that. But also a lot of it has been passed down through the families. We still practice a lot of our culture today, and we still speak our languages, and we practice our traditional beliefs. And so some of it is passed down, some of it is recorded through European writings, letters, those type of things. But there's still quite a bit of oral tradition that we still do today. Wampanoag people speak their language, and they still pass it down orally today. So I'll take one more question, and then I have to head back to the museum. I have a college that I will be speaking with this afternoon. So busy Sunday for me.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So you said you were Cherokee.
That's the nation I'm from.
That's the nation you're from. So
Right.
do you have the same knowledge, if you will, of the Cherokee that you do of the Wampanoag?
Not as much, because I'm not living amongst my people. And so I don't try to attempt to speak my language. I know words and phrases and things like that, but really a language you have to hear every day, right? Because in any language, a small flux in your voice, you can take a really good word to a really bad one. So I don't attempt to speak my language today, but I've been down to North Carolina. I've been to my homeland. I have been amongst Cherokee people. I was in Tahlequah 2 years ago, and Tahlequah is the capital for Cherokee Nation. And I was privileged to get down there for a conference, and the museum sent me, and I said, listen, this is not only a conference that's good for me, but it's where my homeland is. So that kind of convinced them to pay for the trip. But for the very first time in Tahlequah, I was amongst all Native people. White people were a minority there. And I had never experienced that before in my life. My taxi cab driver, Cherokee. The woman at the store, Cherokee. The people who worked in the hotel, Cherokee. Everywhere I went, they were all Cherokee people. And so for the very first time in my life, I experienced being just amongst Native people. And I don't want to say it was weird, but it was different. And here's the other thing. I'm used to Native people that don't have Southern accents, okay? So to hear them talk, and I'm like, no, this is weird for me. I'm used to the Boston accent, for say. But it was I spent 4 days there, and I could live there easily. If I didn't own a house and have somewhat of a career, I'd move there in a minute. It's beautiful. Everywhere in Tahlequah, every street has street signs, and on those street signs, they have the English, and under it, it's written in Cherokee. And every time a new governor comes in, the Cherokee Nation will make a new agreement with that governor to make sure that the Cherokee stays on each sign, which is pretty awesome. It's pretty cool. If you've ever been to Tahlequah, it is entirely dedicated to the indigenous people that were on that homeland. Statues, museums, street names. It's really special. In Tahlequah. Yeah, Tahlequah is the city. Yep. I want to thank you guys for allowing me to be here and be amongst you guys. Hopefully I have passed some knowledge that you didn't have on. And I just really want to say katapatash. That is thank you in the Wampanoag language. Thank you for letting me join you guys today. And come to Plymouth Patuxent Museums if you haven't been there. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Tim, so much for your fantastic presentation and for sharing the artifacts that you have with us so that we can really visualize part of that culture along with your descriptions and your interesting little side comments. Sure.
Forward so I could pack it.
Is there something? Oh, behind me.
Oh, yes.
Anything else? A couple more things. You want to bring them over?
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad you came. Today we honored Indigenous peoples. We can honor them also by donating to the Share the Plate, which is for the First Nations Development Institute. They help Native peoples in 22 states through grants and other ways of providing nourishing Native food, health care, child care, education. They help with community building and house building, and they help save and conserve their lands. You can donate by writing a check to First Parish Church with, you can put FNDI, I think, on the memo part, or a donation. And today we're not sharing the plate, so there are 2 bowls in the back of the room where you can put your checks or donation. There's 1 bowl over there that you could also use. You can also donate throughout the next week by mailing a check, as Catherine said, or you can use that button that you have on the computer and donate that way. And at home, those are the ways that you can donate. Thank you all for coming. Thank you at Zoom for coming. And I just want to say one thing, and then Catherine can, that as you leave, there is hand sanitizer that you can use, and there is a coffee hour in the room on the other side of us. Oh, I'm sorry. It's out on the lawn. There's no tent, but it's out on the lawn. Outside, but it's still warm. It's warm enough. Yeah. Okay. I hope you all enjoy that. And thank you again for coming. I hope I said everything I was supposed to.